Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the RetroTink 2X Pro. Now, first and foremost, before we get into the video here, I just want to give a big shout out to Castlemania Games for sending this to me for free for the purposes of review. I actually included it in an episode of Playload not too long ago, so you can see the unboxing there if you really want to. However, if you're interested in this, you can't actually get it from Castlemania Games anymore. It's now being sold exclusively through Mike Chi's website. There's a link in the description. Mike Chi is the engineer who made it, so I put a link to both of them because A, if you like the product, that's where you can get it, and B, Ryan's just a cool guy. You should go support his, store. He's an awesome dude. So thank you very much to both of them. Now, when it comes to Mike, this dude deserves more credit than I think he gets in the retro community. I'm sure he's getting a lot more, but he deserves even more than that, is basically what I'm saying. Because of this guy and his design, there's way more people now who are able to enjoy their retro game consoles on modern television setups and have it actually look, good. This technology has gone into several things like the Super 64, as well as all those Rad 2X designs. Those are basically just the RetroTink kind of specifically aimed at one particular console. But it all really comes down from the original right here, the RetroTink 2X. Now, I did an entire video of this thing already, so I'll go over a little bit of a micro review of it again as it compares to its newer, younger brother here. But basically, the purpose of this, in case you're totally unclear as to what's going on, is when it comes to retro game consoles, say your N64 or your Genesis or Mega Drive, whatever, you shouldn't really try to just take the stock cables they came with and plug them into a modern television. While that will work in the sense that you will get a picture, it's really not recommended as it's not how it was meant to look, and it often looks very, very bad. Now, we're not going to go into the specifics of why that is, but basically the television doesn't understand the resolution of the console, so it just kind of has to artificially alter it, and it's a bad time. Let's just put it that way. So on the entire spectrum of options to solve this problem, there are super high-end options that look phenomenal, things like the FrameMeister, and you can get all the right cables that go with it, blah, 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 blah. But prohibitively expensive, which is why most people don't do it. And on the other end of that is the worst possible options, things like just plugging it in, just straight up, or even just using a cheap, composite, the yellow cables to the HDMIs, so I get the HDs. Ugh. There's really bad converters out there. Don't get those. Please don't get those. But people do that because they're super, 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 super cheap. So what do you really do in the middle if you're kind of like, I want it to look good, but I also don't want to break the bank doing it? Enter Mike Chi and his RetroTink. Thanks to him, we have a much more affordable, high-end solution. It is not the best solution, but it's a very good one, and I think that's a great place to put it on the spectrum there. So the original RetroTink's basic concept was that, and it had three inputs. It could take composite, the yellow one, which you should really never use in almost all instances. There's only a handful of consoles where that would actually be ideal, and that's only without modification. S-Video, again, same story. It's better, but in most cases you would never really need it. And then there's component input, which we'll get back to, because that's not really component, but it is. We'll get back to it. So it had those three inputs. Now on the side, it had a couple of options here. You had two buttons. One was simply a switch to allow you to go between those inputs. And then one was a button that allowed you to have a pass-through mode, which would basically say, hey, the RetroTink is just going to do nothing. It's just going to take whatever you give it and output it through HDMI, and it's all you. Do whatever you want with it. This is an option, so that you can turn off the functionality. Now, generally, you wouldn't do that. The reason it even does anything is because most televisions will not support a low resolution below 480p on an HDMI input. Now, until you reach the Dreamcast, there are no video game consoles that even output 480p. So if you wanted to take the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo and plug it into a modern television through HDMI, you need it to upscale first in most cases. Otherwise, it just will display nothing on the television. Now, that's not always the case. My 4K TV, for example, does actually understand lower resolutions. That said, I still wouldn't do that. I would still prefer to have a mediator like this because they typically do a much better job of that conversion, thus resulting in a more quality experience. So typically, don't put it in pass-through mode. So what it had is the 2X mode, which is essentially just a line doubler, hence the name, but it will always give you that 480p signal so that at the very least, it'll be vastly more compatible with monitors and TVs out there so that it should always work. On top of that, it had an additional benefit that was basically exclusive to it, which was a smoothing mode. Now that smoothing mode, not for everybody, but the idea was that it could, kind of reduce the jagged edges that appear on a lot of games and just kind of make it look better and kind of just be a sharper, cleaner experience. That's basically what it was in a nutshell. Now, as far as the actual design, it was good, but my initial impression was it was good, but it was flawed. It's just a PCB board with some plexiglass around it to kind of protect it. The ports, I said this originally, and I stand by it. They're on there, they're connected, but they don't feel properly mounted. I always felt like if I was going to plug it in, I had to be very, I had to treat it very gingerly, or it might actually break off. And I still feel that way about it. The buttons that I was talking about are, you can click them, but they're not the most easily accessible buttons. They're on the board. You kind of have to stick your finger under the plexiglass. They're a little close together, and if your finger is a little too big, you might actually struggle with this. On the other side, you had micro USB for power, which was fine. I think in the future, maybe go with USB-C, but it's not really necessary. And then you had micro HDMI or mini HDMI. That I thought was a bad idea, because the problem with that is it's obviously not proprietary, but it is certainly inconvenient, because you at least need an adapter or a specific, micro HDMI to full-size HDMI cable, whereas full-size HDMI cables are vastly more common. They kind of come with everything. So I got like tons of those laying around. I'm sure you guys have a lot of those things laying around. They come with stuff. So the idea that you then had to get another HDMI cable specifically for this was just kind of irritating, and it also prevented you to easily be able to connect it to things like an M cable or an M Classic or whatever. So it was flawed, but it did what it was supposed to do. However, that's where the RetroTink 2X Pro comes in. It has addressed all but one of the issues I had with it, which we'll get back to, and it actually added additional features I never even thought of. So, to start, now, the design is more flush. On the original, all the video inputs were on one side and the audio were on the other. In this case, he's consolidated both component and composite to be on the same side, and S-video appears by itself on the other side. Now, you might look at it and be like, dude, there's no composite. There's no yellow one on there. Fear not, it is actually there. It shares the same port as the green jack. In fact, it even labels it as such. When it comes to component, the more technical term for it would be Y, PB, PR, which are each labeled. And then the more technical term for composite would be, as it says here, CVBS. So it actually shares it. The Y port is the same as the CVBS port. Now, this is not uncommon. My TV actually does this. On the back, it just has one flush set of component ports on it, but the green port is half yellow, half green, thus making it more visually obvious that that's where the composite cable would go. Mike opted not to do this. I'm not entirely certain why, but if I had to guess, I would say it's probably more cost prohibitive to get more customized ports that are two different colors, as opposed to just, there's got to be a ton of stock component green ports out there. So it would have been a cost-cutting measure, and I agree with that decision, only because you really shouldn't be using composite anyway. It's like, it supports it in case you're that guy who wants to use it, but this is just a sign that, hey, you really shouldn't be using composite. And we'll get back to that later. But yeah, so it does have that, as well as S-video. So it's got all three functions retained. Now on the back, there's been several changes. The buttons are vastly easier to click on. They're much more accessible. I like them much more. Input functionality has not changed. It's still the same. You cycle around until you find the thing you want. However, it has been updated to support more options. Now, I don't have any of these to test, and even Mike admits he doesn't have these to test, but he says they at least try now. There's certain PAL formats, or European formats would be a better way to put it, because there's PAL and there's CCAM, that are now supported by this device, but he admits he doesn't have everything to test it with. The original RetroTink, I guess, would not even have tried to use these, but this version will try, and it should be compatible, but you can still run into issues. Now, I don't have them either, so I can't test it, but hey, if you're in Europe, there's a much better chance this will now support more of your stuff, is basically where that goes. But aside from that, there's been no real change to input functionality. The filter button is now separate from the 2X button, or the pass-through button, if you want to call it that. The filter button now acts solely as an option to turn on the smoothing, turn off the smoothing, and it has added scan lines. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of scan lines. I don't get it. I don't know why people like having extra lines on the screen. I get it's it's supposed to look like an old CRT, whatever. I get there's a nostalgia vibe to that, but to actually say that looks better, hey man, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Let's put it that way. Because I don't get it. I don't personally like it. But hey, don't worry. If you do like it, they're there. You have that functionality now. Keep in mind that if you are going to add scan lines, you're going to turn on, it does make the image darker, so you'll have to upscale or increase the brightness of your television to get more of that vibe I think you're probably going for if you're the guy who's into scan lines. But it is there. Now, as I said, the pass-through mode and the 2x mode are now separated. It's a switch on the side. And I'm just going to keep it in 2x mode because there's really, honestly, no reason to ever turn that off, in my opinion. Maybe there's some situations where you might like it, but I'm just leaving that on all the time. And he's added a new feature called Comb. This has two options. One is called Retro and one is called Auto. It is my understanding that the Retro mode is intended primarily for most video game consoles that you would ever connect to this thing. The Auto mode is actually for additional functionality that was always present but never really considered, which is the ability to connect a VCR, a Laserdisc player, a DVD player. If you want it to process those, video works differently than gameplay. So while it may not be super apparent what it's doing, that is the recommended mode in those in the event that you are connecting any of those, because it'll just be subtly different here and there, and that would be better for that particular experience. However, when it comes to video games, that still has a purpose. As it turns out, Auto would be recommended more for the 6th gen era stuff. And when 6th gen would be like GameCube, PS2, original Xbox, Dreamcast, the new one, etc. PlayStation 2, if I didn't already say that. There's 5 6th gen consoles. It would be recommended for those because that's just what Mike said. He's like, that's more of the wheelhouse of that. However, there is a big catch to what I just said, and we'll get back to it. But basically, if you want to connect the PlayStation 2, for example, keep it in auto mode, but pretty much every other game console before it, you're just going to keep in retro mode. And anything that's HDMI compliant already, like the Xbox 360, the PS3, the Wii U, whatever, you would never need to use with this device. On the back, he has not changed the micro USB port. That's still the same. However, it does have additional functionality. Unlike the original, which was not really firmware upgradable unless you had specific tools or you just sent it to Mike and he took care of it for you. This one is easy to update. I've done it already. It takes like a minute. Basically, you go on to Mike's website, you download some software, you download the latest firmware, you run that software, you connect this through the USB port on your computer, and it just kind of sees it and says, okay, this is the firmware you've got, boom, just run that, flash it, and okay, we're done. And that's about it. It's very, very simple, very, very nice. But there's instructions on his website in the event that you want to do that. He also, thankfully, full-size HDMI output. No more do I need stupid little adapters or anything like that. You have full-on native compatibility with all the cables that we've already got. Gives you full connectivity to the M cable and the M Classic, which obviously I'm a big fan of that, so I think that that's awesome. So it's almost like completely resolving every issue I had with it. It is a far superior device, and having used it now for a while, I really like the quality of the gaming experience that it's given me. There's only one flaw with it, and it's not really Mike's fault. He's just kind of dealing with a problem that no one else ever solved. This is just the logical consequence of that outcome. So basically, it's the same flaw that existed in this. When you look at it and you think, you might think, oh, okay, components. So this would be good if I have a Nintendo Wii and I want to use like a Nintendo Wii with an HDMI cable. I could use this because it's a component to HDMI converter. No. Despite it actually looking like component, you might as well think of it as just an RGB Scart port. This is not really component. It is, but it isn't. It's not high definition component. It's basically standard definition component. And the reason for that is in a lot of our older game consoles, say the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, particularly the first model, what have you, they have RGB modes in them, which was basically just a very clean, clear signal. But in North America, we were never really given anything to access it, unless you worked in broadcasting. Whereas in Europe, they had SCART. Now, SCART gave you the option to use full RGB modes, and in North America, at least in the retro community, we've been kind of taking advantage of that, and that's why that's how you connect it to things like the FrameMeister. Hell, Mike addresses himself. This is the RetroTink SCART edition. This is actually just the exact same tech, but instead of using component jacks, it uses a SCART jack. You really should just think of these as exactly the same, despite looking completely different. And like I said, we typically think of component as a high def format. In this context, it's a standard def format. So I personally use the SCART edition because my entire cable infrastructure is SCART. But in North America, we have a problem because we never got any sort of RGB equivalency. We never got a SCART equivalency. The closest we ever got was actually component, but no console that actually natively would work with this actually ever really had component cables. Again, for example, the Sega Genesis. There are no officially made component cables ever released for that console. Yet, if you were to run the RetroTink 2X Pro with it, what you would want to do is run it with component cables so that you get the RGB signal. How does that work then? Well, another company has come to our aid here, and that's HD Retrovision, who's actually based here in Chicago, represent. They made a whole bunch of component cables for older game consoles. Again, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Neo Geo CD, and AES. I mean, the list goes on. There's tons of them. And those will work with this. But that basically means you need this plus those cables, and that's the same flaw that existed with the original. It's not really the fault of the device, it's just kind of, what do you want? We don't have an option, because even if you go with the SCART version, cool, but you still need to get all the SCART cables. This is more of a problem for people in North America than it is for people in Europe, but it is something that you have to deal with. So that's just something you need to be aware of, is that you would, if you want to get the best out of the Genesis, you don't just say, hey, look, I'll take the composite cables and stick it in there and that'll be fine. Like, you can, but don't do that. You should get the HD Retrovision component cables, otherwise you're just wasting your time. Because when it comes to video cables, you kind of have to think of like going from the console to the first cable to this device to the HDMI cable to the television as like the ingredients to an omelet. And let's say, you know, you have the console itself, and that's like the really good tomatoes. Like I went out and got farm fresh tomatoes, and then you have this device, and that's like, you know, a really good, like, you know, some really good ham or something like that, like good meat. And then you have a real, you know, this is like the HDMI cable I got. I'm using an M Classic. That's like getting like the best quality cheese, and my TV's a 4K, and so like I have this, and that's like the best quality, like mushrooms or peppers or whatever you want to put into it, and that's all great. But in there, you use the composite cable, which is like using rotten eggs in the omelet. It's like, it doesn't matter that all the other things you put in there were amazing. You put in rotten eggs. These eggs are like a decade old. I don't even know why you still have them. And they're in somebody's like uncle's cabin who nobody ever checked on. And we decided to make the omelet with those. That's what using composite cables in that chain is like. You just ruin the entire experience, and it's unfixable. I mean, would you eat an omelet like that that's made out of 10-year-old rotten eggs even though everything else was good? Probably not. So why are you connecting your videos that way? That's basically why I would never recommend using something like composite. It's just that that enters in the price factor again, because you do need the proper cables. So, all right, assuming you understand that all, you're probably still wondering like, okay, well, I don't have those, but what I do have is I have my Nintendo Wii, I have my GameCube, I have my original Xbox. Can I use the component cables with those? Not really. And that is, I'm not sure if that's a fault of the device. I don't know if that's fixable or not. I don't think this is something that Mike is in any way unaware of. It just may be a limitation of the hardware. I'm honestly not sure. Because basically what happens is the RetroTink 2X is not capable of inputting high definition support or even enhanced definition support. So the Wii, for example, when you connect it via the component cables, you have the option for the Wii itself to render and output in 480p. So if you were to connect it to this, you would think, okay, cool, this thing already does 480p, so it's just going to pass it through. Even in pass-through mode, that's not the case. What ends up happening is you get a display error. And this is an example of it running on the original Xbox. As you can see, the game is split into two screens and looks very bad. This is the original Xbox running in 480p and the RetroTink trying to understand it. So what that means is, you really shouldn't use this with the Nintendo Wii, the Nintendo GameCube, or the original Xbox. In fact, there's only two consoles, or the Dreamcast, by the way, because again, that runs in 480p if you have the upcoming eventual component cables for it. There's really only two consoles that natively output component that you should use with the RetroTink 2X. The new one, as nobody has ever heard of, and of course, the PlayStation 2. Now, the PlayStation 2 is kind of a unique case because even though it does technically support higher resolution modes, it's extremely uncommon. There's nearly 5,000 games on the PlayStation 2 released worldwide, and about 180 of them support higher resolution modes, and like half of those are sports games. Not literally half, but it's a good chunk of them. So while there's some legitimately good games in there that actually do support the modes, and it's just kind of sad that you can't use them easily, namely Rule of Rose, for the most part, the vast majority of PlayStation 2 games that you love and remember, you're going to want to use with the RetroTink 2X Pro. I think that that's a good way to go. So that's kind of about does it for the background information and everything like that. So now I'm sure what you want to do is take a look at some gameplay, right? So basically, I've decided, all right, look, when it comes to retro game consoles and people asking like, hey man, how do I get the best out of this one and that one and this one? The two hardest that ever come up are the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 2. They both suffer from the same flaw, which is they really were not future-proofed. You know, they just didn't have the best video quality, and there's not really any great way to make them look good. All you can really do is make them look less bad. That's about it. And it's unfortunate because obviously they're two of the most popular game consoles of all time. So for our purposes, we're not using the N64. We're going to connect. It was never my favorite. Like this, we're just going to connect. It's the most iconic console of the 6th generation. Everyone knows that. And it wasn't my favorite. The Dreamcast was my favorite, but we're going to wire it up and I'm going to show you guys what it's like. And so here you go. This is it. This is, as you're all fully aware, I don't even need to say anything. This is the Samsung or Toshiba Nuon. Of course, obviously I didn't need to mention it. Running what is perhaps the most iconic game ever produced in the history of our species, Freefall 3050. I mean, I didn't need to say it. You all knew it. But when running the Nuon, again, you guys know it so well. But running this console, you can see that it looks pretty good. Well, actually, in all seriousness, obviously nobody has ever really looked at the Nuon before. And I'm taking great pride in this because I have the Nuon running through component cables. It has natural component output, but it only runs at, I think it's like 360p. So the RetroTink is actually taking that signal through component. It's outputting at 480p. It's doing line doubling on top of that, and it's doing line doubling to get to 480p, and it's also doing some smoothing. Then I have the M Classic attached to it for color enhancement, additional resolution upscaling, as well as jagged edges removal. So I'm just gonna say it. Even though none of you have ever looked at the Nuon, trust me, this is the best it's ever looked in the history of the entire human race. I am super proud that I got to bring that to you because I'm sure that was very important to all of you. No, in all seriousness, what is actually important to all of you is, of course, the PlayStation 2. Now, the PS2 is by far the most requested console I ever hear about when it comes to, like, how do I make it look better? And as I said, you can't really make it look good. You can't look. It will never look the way your 9-year-old self remembers. That wasn't really real. It's just kind of, you can make it look less bad on a modern setup. And I will say this, the RetroTink 2X Pro, under the right conditions, is exactly how I would recommend using the PlayStation 2. If you take the PlayStation 2 and you run it through the HD Retrovision component cables, which I actually think are the single greatest component cables made for that console, you run it with those, you make sure it's in YPBPR mode, and then you run it with this, you turn on the line doubling mode, you turn on the smoothing mode, then you connect an M Classic to it. That's the best it's ever going to look. Okay, and that's what you're seeing right here. This is the game Shinobi, and I just wanted to give a still kind of shot here of just kind of the backgrounds. This is the best the PlayStation 2 will ever look without hardware modification, namely some sort of internal HDMI board. But just to give you a comparison's sake, this is it running with Composite. This is going all the way down to the yellow cables. And while there is a difference there, you'll notice that it's not huge. It is better, but it's a tad more subtle. And again, that's what I mean by you can never really make it look good. You can only make it look less bad. You're more or less chipping away at the problem. So if we can jump up a little bit. If you want to say, look, I just want to connect it with the RetroTink 2X Pro. I don't want any of your M Classic stuff. I don't care about that. That's fine. This is it just running straight with Composite. This is running Composite pass-through, or sorry, component pass-through. Not a problem. And then we can do additional. You can have it go line doubling with a little bit of smoothing there. And then that looks fine. But then when you add the M Classic back into it, that's really where it gets its best. But that's the PlayStation 2, man. It's a flaw of that console. It's not a flaw of this particular device. But if you're asking me, what do I do with the PlayStation 2? That is still what I recommend is the RetroTink 2X, now the Pro version, with its smoothing and all sorts of features and so on. I will say that the footage, I feel, doesn't really do it justice. When I was tinkering with it, no pun intended there, I connected the PlayStation 2, I had it running with my ideal setup as I've just described, and I actually, for the first time ever, thought, wow, PS2 is actually looking kind of decent with all of this. But that's, you know, again, you need this. You need the HD Retrovision cables. You need the M Classic. And then that starts to add up. So I see why that would be a flaw for people. But that's not a fault of the device. It's just kind of giving you another choice. So in the end, I would say that I do recommend the RetroTink 2X Pro. Just keep in mind that you do need certain infrastructure elements to get the best out of it. But it offers you those options and is in almost every way, save one, is a huge improvement over the original. But if you're wondering, well, I have the original, should I upgrade to this? That's up to you. I would say probably not. You probably don't really need that upgrade unless you're into scan lines. Then it definitely. But because most of the upgrades to it at that point are just kind of subtle things. Like I said, there's the comb mode. There's some additional things like on the board itself that are in the firmware that are a little different here and there and better or worse in other situations. If you like the aesthetic of it, that's another matter. Or if you just accidentally break it by plugging it in too hard, whatever, sure. But yeah, overall, at that point, it just kind of boils down to like which infrastructure do you want. So I think that was Mike's solution to the component problem was just, hey, I'll give you both. If you like SCART, cool, you got that. If you like component, cool, you got that. So if you want to use all the old school cables that already exist, boom. Granted, you have to import them from Europe. Or if you want to buy all the newer HD Retrovision component cable options, either way, you're covered. So that's pretty much it. If there is a way to somehow, at the very least, get the RetroTink 2X to support component pass-through, even if it did nothing else to it, then it would at least be compatible with the Wii and the GameCube and some original Xbox content. Well, most, I should say, original. I mean, the 720p stuff wouldn't work, but I don't know if that's possible. I'm guessing if it was, if Mike could do that, he would have already done it. I very seriously doubt he's just anyway unaware of it. Hey guys, sorry about the weird cut there. So I was in post-production on the video and this was announced. The RetroTink multi-format. So funny enough, obviously I don't have this device. Mike Chi just announced it. Basically, I'll hopefully do a review of it when it comes about, but it is an upgrade to the RetroTink Pro, sort of. It is my understanding that the RetroTink Pro is still better for 240p and below content, so namely your 16-bit, 8-bit era stuff. However, the interesting thing about this, the multi-format, is that it's actually specifically designed for 480i and 40p content. So that means it would actually be recommended for things like the Wii, the GameCube, the PlayStation 2, potentially the Xbox. In some cases, it obviously won't work with the 720p and the handful of 1080i games, although you really should just always leave your Xbox at 720p. But yeah, so interesting, there is a solution coming as I'm in the production of this video, so hey, alright. Anyway, let's wrap up the rest of the video. There you go, that's my basic overview of the RetroTink 2X Pro. If you're interested in it, again, there will be a link in the description to Mike's website, and again, Castlemania Games, so you can just check them out and support them. So thank you very much. There's also social media stuff in the description. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, all that sort of stuff. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all later.